The early 2000s were home to some of the most influential titles on the market, but out of all of them, the MMOs were in a league of their own. As the internet grew more and more commonplace amongst the average household, so too with the rise of so many classics. Each of them are legendary in their own way, but today we're here to discuss only one. This is the MMO that defined a generation. To really understand the game and its legacy, it's important we go over the roots that would bear the fruits of its labor. Before Phantasy Star Online, there was just Phantasy Star, Sega's flagship JRPG series, which had its start all the way back in 1987 on the Sega Master System. Unlike all of the other major JRPGs at the time, our titular title stood out due to its unique aesthetic. The theme was heavily inspired from Star Wars and its blending of two different cultures. Through this idea, the game blends science fiction with medieval fantasy to create a hybrid aesthetic still seen today. With a combination of both a first-person dungeon crawling experience, captivating setting, and as well as having one of the few female protagonists at the time, the first game would be heralded as a landmark in the JRPG genre. The series would go on to span across several titles, which is now dubbed by fans as the Algo series, named after the star system in which the series takes place in. After the release of the fourth main entry, the series would end up in somewhat of a stasis. It would be years later before the series would undergo a significant shift that would change the series forever. Fast forwarding the clock a bit, we now arrive towards the development of the Sega Dreamcast. This would be the console that ultimately paved the way for online gaming and how we'd interact with it today. Despite it being an unfortunately short-lived console, one cannot deny just how important it really was. Online gaming was already becoming prevalent, especially with the rise of the MMO, massively multiplayer online. Unlike other online multiplayer games, MMOs could support a massive player count, something that most multiplayer games at the time couldn't do, let alone on the console. But let's alter course for a bit and shift the topic to a dev team of no real major importance. Though Sonic Adventure didn't have online multiplayer, it did have the ability to allow players to download special content related to the Chao Garden. They could even upload their Chao data and check up on a messaging board. As minor as it may seem, even dominoes eventually topple across the entire course. It wouldn't be long, of course, before Sonic Team developed a true online multiplayer experience in a relatively niche title known as Choo Choo Rocket. With real-time online multiplayer and the ability to share custom puzzles, this game would be the catalyst towards what would be their biggest project yet. It was no secret that Isao Okawa, chairman of Sega at the time, wanted the Dreamcast to be a console that paved the way for online connectivity. Of course, while the console did have online features, there wasn't anything to consider a true flagship online game for the system. So, of course, the task would fall on the aforementioned team. Spearheading development would be a famous figure amongst the Sonic community, Yuji Naka. Having originally worked on the first Phantasy Star as the main programmer, he always wanted to create a multiplayer Phantasy Star game, and so their next project would be an indirect follow-up to the series. Thus, Phantasy Star Online would be born, and much like its originator, would also become a landmark RPG. So what exactly is PSO? Well, it's an action RPG first and foremost. The story is going to take a bit of explaining so that you'd understand the full context. In pursuit of a new world to colonize, the planet of Coral has become nearly uninhabitable due to endless warfighting. As such, the Pioneer project was created in which two ships, Pioneer 1 and 2, would set out to outer space to find and colonize a new life-sustaining planet known as Ragol. Pioneer 1 takes off first and begins the first colonies on said planet. 7 years later, Pioneer 2 takes off now that preparations were made for them to arrive. However, an explosion occurs on the Ragol colony known as the Central Dome, and all contact with Pioneer 1 disappears. You take the control of a hunter, a mercenary, tasked with investigating the explosion and finding out what happened to Pioneer 1. There's quite a bit I've skimmed over, but it'd be forever if I went in depth on it. PSO's story has a lot of connecting threads and would require a separate video to cover. If you've been paying attention so far, which I hope you have been, you'd notice some of the gameplay footage presented in the video. The game is an action RPG where you fight through the native monsters of Ragol, take on side quests, and go through the game's main dungeons. You're able to select a command based on the input you assign them to. You have your standard attack, and a stronger, less accurate version with the weapon you have equipped. Then, there's a special attack only available on specific weapons. All 3 attacks can be performed 3 times in a row if you time each one just right, which is how you maximize your DPS. Magic, or techniques as it's called in these games, also has a variety of effects. Each technique has a set level that goes from 1 to 20, which you can acquire through drops and the in-game shops. As the technique rises in level, it gets stronger, as well as the attack techniques having their animations changing to account for it. The animation changes have no real bearing on gameplay, but it's the flavor that really sells the progression. In fact, progression is extremely straightforward. You've got standard equipment progression going from rarities and such. Then you also have the difficulty options. Much like Diablo, beating the normal difficulty unlocks the next tier and so on until you reach ultimate. And at the ultimate difficulty, the enemies will change in their ultimate variants as well as a slight change to the location scenery. Of course, what's an MMO without classes? In this game, classes are split into 3 categories: Hunters, Rangers, and Force. Hunters are your standard melee class, Rangers focus more on guns, and Force is all about staves and magic. Within each class, you'll have a split between 4 subtypes which focus on slight stat growth and specialties. All 3 races will include 2 male characters and 2 females. However, both Hunters and Rangers have something known as casts, or essentially androids. These are mechanical lifeforms who can't use techniques, but they can use traps. Traps are something you can place in a given map, and you'll gain more of them the higher level. These range from the standard damage trap, a confusion trap, and a freeze trap. Their physical stats also tend to be more focused compared to the non-cast. As for the Force, they don't have casts for obvious reasons. Their characters focus between different types of magic. If that wasn't enough, the game would also have a unique pet system that would help define builds for each class. Mags are creatures developed by Pioneer 1 which assist hunters in their day-to-day operations. By feeding them items, they'll grow in certain stats, which will buff your character accordingly. At certain levels, they'll evolve into a new form and adopt new special attacks known as Photon Blast. And if you think that the variety ends here, oh no, you'd be wrong. Quick question, what do you think affects the drop rates in this game? I'm sure you all think of the standard drop table that any MMO has, right? You'd be sort of right, but there's another factor to the equation at hand. This is the Section ID, a special insignia that every character has that affects the drop rates for weapons in the game. There are 10 of them in total, and each specializes around a handful of equipment. This is one of the most important mechanics in the game if you're going to go after specific rare drops. Now, how do you determine this Section ID? Do you simply select it? Perhaps it's based off of your class, or maybe it's actually just based on your name. Because it is. PSO might be one of the only few games where your name actually has meaning. Thankfully, you aren't left in the dust trying to figure out endless combinations. There's a website that'll help determine your section ID of your character based on what name you give it. You just need to make sure you select the right version of PSO. This might not be the most important early on, but once you start reaching the higher difficulties, you'll wish your ranger was able to get the legendary handgun gold. For a game made in 2000, it's got a nice variety of characters to choose from even if they are gender locked. It offers a surprising amount of depth and customization despite the lack of cosmetics and modern features. And I think it's imperative for me to state the gameplay won't look as fast or clean as modern action games. But if that's all that mattered, then this game wouldn't have attained the success and fame it has, now would it? After all, here on this channel we find the fun in games for better or worse. So consider subscribing, because I'm about to explain the success and the legacy it left behind. It's easy to say that an MMO is what it is because it's a multiplayer game. And yeah, that's true. Most people, when talking about certain titles, all agree that the multiplayer aspect is by far the biggest part of a game. PSO, for its time, featured the ability to connect to players on a global scale. Whether you were English or Japanese, it didn't matter. You could communicate with the most unlikely of players through simple inputs, and that, to me, really showed just how ahead of its time the game really was. While you could only party with a total of 4 players, I believe these smaller parties actually led to far more interaction within the player base than standard MMO raiding parties. After all, it's far easier to communicate in a party of 4 than say 8 or 16. Not to mention, the game's maps weren't too big and were very easy to navigate through. The simplicity of the gameplay loop might have also helped, given that it would be extremely easy to get into. MMOs usually have a bit of a beginner's learning curve when it comes to fully understanding the mechanics and endgame requirements. And while there's been guides posted throughout forums and the like, the average player at the time probably wasn't going through those. The point is, games like PSO help sell the online multiplayer experience to many players, including myself. It really speaks volumes when the game managed to last with its servers up until 2010, where it met its faithful end. But that doesn't mean the game is over and done with. No, in fact, the game is still being played to this very day. How, you might ask? With Zephynia BB, a private server that uses PSO's Blue Burst Edition, one which contains bonus content, among other things, as well as the game being released on PC. This means that if you want to have that PSO experience, but you really don't have the means or want to use a GameCube controller on your computer, then this is it. I'm not really afraid of speaking about a private server since Sega, as we all know, is extremely chill with third-party projects so long as they aren't monetizable. The gameplay isn't for everyone, but if you're looking for something to do with your friends that doesn't require too much resources, then I think this might be a good fit. PSO isn't a game that just carries itself on gameplay. It's about the environment, the atmosphere, the progression with your friends, seeing new areas, learning more about the game, evolving your mags, and so much more. Is it any wonder that this game inspired other franchises? At the end of the day, I could recommend people play this game all they want, and perhaps a handful will and the rest will click off. But I think what's more important is the understanding and recognition that gaming history has on the medium. It's games like these that paved the way for landmark series. In a timeline where games are becoming more live service, written with slop, and rushed development, it's hard to really feel deeply connected with games. But so long as we have titles that provide a beacon of hope for the industry, I think we can find the light in the darkness. So remember, for every big game in the 2000s, we'll need to evolve with every big game now. With that, I take my leave. Peace.